The Pacific at night was a vast black mirror, silent, endless, and more dangerous than almost any battlefield on Earth. Japanese destroyers prowled through the darkness with searchlights and hydrophones. Submarines lurked beneath the waves. Patrol aircraft scanned from above. In those waters, the Americans unleashed a new kind of weapon, the PT boat. Small, fast, and armed with torpedoes powerful enough to rip a destroyer in half, PT boats became the Navy's knives in the dark. But they carried a fatal weakness. They were loud. Their engines screamed across the ocean like buzz saws. Their propellers churned the water into frothing trails. Even when running slow, the boats left signatures Japanese radar operators had learned to detect, not from reflections, but from wake patterns and radar surface ripples that appeared whenever a propeller disturbed the water in predictable ways. The Japanese called these signatures ghost wakes. They looked faint, almost invisible, but to trained operators on modern Type 22 and Type 13 radar sets, they were enough. When the screens flickered with those faint streaks, Japanese officers shouted warnings across the deck. PT boats approaching fast. Soon, Japanese destroyers grew confident. They believed PT boats could no longer surprise them at night. Radar wasn't perfect, but it was good enough, and they trusted it more with every passing attack. But the Americans were watching. They were listening. And deep inside a cramped workshop built from plywood and rusted sheet metal, a quiet engineer named Mason Ellery began noticing something no one else cared to see. Ellery wasn't a pilot, not a captain, not a designer from a big military contractor. He was a field engineer, just one man stationed with PT Squadron 12 on a battered strip of coastline. He fixed engines, patched hulls, and worked on propellers that returned beaten and bent from high-speed chases. He worked quietly, but he observed everything. One night, while examining a damaged propeller, Ellery noticed something strange. The blades had bent in a way that prevented water from slipping cleanly across them. Instead of slicing water into smooth currents, they had begun to push water in uneven spirals. Yet when he tested the engine with that damaged prop, something unexpected happened. The boat produced less wake. It was slower, less efficient, but quieter in the water. That bothered him. That intrigued him. That inspired him. Because PT boats didn't need to outrun destroyers all the time. They just needed to reach torpedo range without being detected. Over the next several days, Ellery began comparing different propellers. Damaged ones, new ones, bent ones, repaired ones. He noticed patterns, small changes in blade curvature dramatically altered how water churned behind the boat. One night, while sitting alone on the edge of a pier, he watched bioluminescent plankton swirl around a PT boat's wake like glowing diamonds. The water behind the boat illuminated the entire shape of the disturbance, and Ellery saw something others never did. The wake wasn't just a trail. It was a fingerprint, and radar could read it. He began carving small wooden models by hand, dipping them into buckets of seawater and watching the flow patterns under lantern light. He spun them slowly, imitating propeller movement, measuring how water curled, separated, and collided. The key wasn't strength. The key wasn't speed. The key wasn't noise. It was the shape of the disturbance. Japanese radar didn't detect PT boats directly. Their hulls were too small, too low, too wooden, but the disturbance behind them, the wake rippling across the ocean, reflected faint radar signals in predictable, rhythmic bursts. Every PT boat using standard propellers created that pattern without exception. Ellery's realization struck hard. If he could build a propeller that didn't create a radar-readable wake, the PT boat would become invisible. It sounded insane. Impossible. absurd to the senior officers who barely understood radar themselves. But Ellery kept working. One morning, he approached his commanding officer holding a bent, asymmetrical propeller he had hammered into a strange shape. Blades curved unevenly, tips clipped at odd angles, edges shaved into a softened profile. The officer stared at it like a useless piece of scrap. "That thing will shake the engine apart," he said. Ellery didn't argue, he simply said, "Let me test it." Reluctantly, the officer agreed to use PT-198, a boat known for its sturdy engines but poor speed. If anything went wrong, at least the men trusted the boat not to explode. Before sunrise, with the sky still dark and the waves calm, Ellery climbed aboard with a small crew. They pushed out from the shoreline, the engines rumbling softly. At first, the boat behaved normally. Then Ellery eased the throttle. The officers watching from the shore expected to see a long, bright wake arc behind the boat, the telltale sign every PT produced under even modest throttle. But the wake was short, uneven, broken, not smooth waves, not patterned ripples, not the rhythmic disturbance radar could identify. It looked like nothing. The officer on shore frowned, rubbing his eyes. "Where's the wake should be longer." A second officer lowered his binoculars. It's there, but it's sloppy. It's not forming correctly." Ellery grinned quietly. They didn't realize yet what they were seeing, but Ellery did. The damaged, asymmetrical propeller wasn't pushing water into a predictable pattern. It was creating a chaotic, irregular wake, one that scattered radar reflections in a million directions instead of sending clean returns back to Japanese receivers. To radar, the PT boat simply vanished. The tests continued. They pushed the throttle harder. The boat shuddered slightly, yes, but the wake remained broken, messy, nearly invisible. The speed was lower than a pristine propeller, but still fast enough for stealth attacks. The officers were puzzled. "But we've always used symmetrical props," one said. "They're balanced, they're efficient, they're fast." Ellery nodded. "And predictable wakes, predictable reflections, predictable signatures." He tapped the bent edges of his handmade prop. "This one is not predictable." Word spread quickly, and soon, radar technicians ran controlled experiments. They placed a Japanese radar unit recovered earlier in the war on a nearby hill. They pointed it toward PT-198 as it made multiple runs across the bay. On radar, the standard propeller produced strong ghost wakes, deep lines, clear patterns. The silent propeller produced nothing. Just ocean. The technicians stared at their screens, their jaws tightening. This shouldn't be possible." Ellery crossed his arms. "It is now." Soon, PT crews were lining up to see the experiment repeated. They wanted to believe it, but they needed proof. They needed to witness a boat disappear. So Ellery performed the test again, this time with nearly the entire squadron watching from the beach. PT-198 left the dock. The engines revved. The boat accelerated. And the water behind it remained quiet, unpatterned, almost calm. One crewman whispered, "It's like it's not even there." And that was exactly the point. Over the next week, Ellery refined his design. He hammered and filed different configurations. He experimented with blade lengths, pitch angles, and clipped tips. He tested dual-blade variations, tri-blade variants, and even hybrid shapes. By the end of his tests, he had created something extraordinary. A propeller optimized not for speed, not for efficiency, But for stealth, a silent propeller. It wasn't truly silent, the engines still made noise, but the wake signature, the radar profile, the hydrodynamic footprint, all of it melted into the ocean. News spread across the Pacific like wildfire. Commander Bulow of Motor Torpedo Boat Squadron 21 ordered full testing. Radar operators confirmed it again and again. PT boats fitted with Ellery's propellers could approach within torpedo range before Japanese radar even blinked. Some nights, entire Japanese screens failed to detect them until torpedoes were already cutting through the black water toward their hulls. The Japanese were confused, then alarmed, then terrified. They had trusted their radar to keep them safe in the night. They had believed their destroyers would detect anything approaching fast, but now torpedoes struck without warning. Explosions lit the darkness with no enemy in sight. Survivors reported invisible boats, silent attackers, ghost vessels moving with no wake. Japanese radar officers were reprimanded, then replaced, then investigated. But the truth was simple. Their radar wasn't broken. America had made PT boats invisible. Ellery's silent propeller was installed on more boats across the theater. Torpedo attacks doubled in success rate. Japanese convoys began sailing wider arcs, burning more fuel, slowing their supply lines dramatically. Their commanders ordered constant searchlight sweeps, but the silent propeller allowed PT boats to slip between the beams like shadows. Japanese sailors developed a superstition. If the water is quiet, the Americans are near. The jungle, the night, the ocean, everything became suspect. And the PT boats, they became hunters. Ellery never asked for promotion, never asked for recognition, never asked for reward. He simply watched from the pier each night as PT boats raced into the dark with his strange, bent metal propellers spinning quietly behind them. Boats that once screamed across the waves now glided like predators. Boats once detected miles away now appeared from nowhere. Boats once vulnerable now became phantoms. And Japanese sailors would soon learn the full terror of a weapon they could not see. Because the silent propeller wasn't just an invention. It was an evolution. Something the Japanese weren't ready for. Something they couldn't counter. Something that broke their trust in radar forever. And the next major battle would reveal just how devastating the effect truly was. The first night the modified PT boat went out on a real mission, even the crew didn't fully believe the engineer's invention would work. They trusted their engines, their gunnery, their training, but this strange, quiet propeller that looked like nothing they had ever seen before, it felt like a gamble, one that could either save them or expose them completely. The boat pushed off into the darkness with a low, steady hum, not the usual buzzing roar that rattled the deck and echoed across the water. This hum was different, softer, smoother, almost polite. The chief engineer stood near the engines, one hand resting on the safety rail, listening closely. He knew exactly how a PT boat should sound. He also knew exactly how dangerous its usual noise profile was. But what he heard now was promising. The vibrations along the hull were gentler. The harmonics that normally shivered through the deck were gone. The shifting tones that radar arrays interpreted as a moving blade signature felt muted, swallowed. If he hadn't been standing next to the engines, he might not have believed they were even running. The officers on the bridge spoke in hushed tones. The captain took the wheel and eased the boat into open ocean, avoiding channels where Japanese patrol craft sometimes lurked. They passed the outer marker, then the last glimmer of shoreline vanished behind a curtain of tropical darkness. Soon the PT boat accelerated, first to 10 knots, then 16, then 20. Still nothing. No metallic buzzing. No rhythmic blade chopping. No telltale acoustic footprint rising from the stern. At 25 knots, the captain finally said what everyone else was thinking. "Feels like we're ghosts." The engineer didn't smile. He was too focused, too aware of what was at stake. Radar detection had killed dozens of PT boats already, and the Japanese were getting better at it. Every week, Allied commanders noticed shifts in enemy behavior. Their radar operators began predicting boat approaches with unsettling accuracy. Interception lines tightened. Searchlight sweeps narrowed. The enemy was learning. But now, for the first time in months, this PT boat wasn't announcing itself across the ocean. They moved deeper into enemy waters with confidence, testing the edges of Japanese detection zones. The mission was simple: insert a reconnaissance team near a Japanese anchorage, a task that normally carried serious risk. Radar picket ships guarded the approaches. Searchlights scanned the water. Patrol boats prowled the perimeter, listening for the faint thrum of American engines. This mission was a test of the silent propeller. The crew approached the first detection line, the radar perimeter that usually forced PT boats to slow down or alter course. The captain gave a small nod. In the darkness, the engineer leaned forward, listening for any change in the engine's rhythm. The boat crossed the line. Nothing happened. No movement on the horizon. No sirens. No searchlights activating. No enemy patrols redirecting. Japanese radar operators sitting in dimly lit rooms miles away continued scanning blank screens. Their equipment hummed steadily, sweeping back and forth, analyzing echoes, reading signatures, following their algorithms. But this time, the American torpedo boat acoustic fingerprint simply wasn't there. They saw nothing. They heard nothing. Their instruments told them nothing was approaching. The PT boat was already behind them. The crew exchanged glances, silent, nervous, exhilarated. For the first time, they felt what the engineer had hoped they would feel: control over their own presence, control over their visibility, control over whether they lived or died. By the time they reached the drop-off point, the success was undeniable. The reconnaissance team slipped into the water silently, paddled to shore, and disappeared into the foliage. The PT boat retreated into open water, still unseen. Hours passed. The sun began to rise. The reconnaissance team returned, exhausted but successful. The PT boat picked them up and turned for home. But the test wasn't over yet. The return trip would bring them close to Japanese patrol lanes, the true proving ground. Radar stations often intensified scanning near dawn. Patrol boats adjusted routes, preparing for the day shift. This was the moment when mistakes were most costly. The crew prepared themselves for possible contact. The captain kept the throttle steady. The engineer monitored every vibration. The men on deck scanned the horizon. They passed the second radar line, deeper, more sensitive. Again, nothing happened. Searchlights stayed dim. Patrol boats did not alter course. Japanese radio operators did not chatter. The PT boat wasn't just quieter. It was invisible. When they reached the friendly shoreline, the sun was fully rising. The crew felt a weight lifting off them, the realization that they had just pulled off something impossible. The engineer sat down on a crate near the engine compartment, exhausted. For weeks he had worked with crude tools, improvised materials, and sketches drawn on scrap paper. His silent propeller was built on a theory his superiors dismissed as impossible, and yet here they were. and the Navy would never be the same again. News traveled fast, commanders demanded reports, engineers asked for blueprints, higher-ranking officers wanted explanations. The first formal test was scheduled 3 days later. This time the silent propeller would be tested under controlled conditions, monitored radars, documented distances, predetermined courses, no mission pressure, no improvisation, just pure measurement. Japanese radar wasn't available for testing, but American radar was. And if American radar couldn't detect the boat, Japanese equipment never would. On the day of the trial, weather was perfect, calm seas, clear sky, minimal wind, ideal conditions for radar. Technicians monitored the screens closely as the PT boat began its run at 10 knots. No detection. The boat accelerated to 15 knots. Still no detection. At 20 knots, one technician leaned forward, confused. The scope flickered once, then returned to normal. Probably seabirds, his supervisor muttered. At 25 knots, the boat's wake became slightly brighter on the technician's display, but still no solid radar contact. By 30 knots, the radar picked up a faint ghost signature, then lost it again. The supervisor frowned. That can't be right, something's interfering. The silent propeller was working exactly as intended. Radar detection didn't rely solely on radio waves bouncing off metal surfaces. It relied partly on disturbances created in the water, microbubbles, pressure waves, harmonic echoes. Traditional propellers generated all of these, creating a detectable bubble trail that radar interpreted as movement. But this new propeller minimized cavitation so drastically that the radar had almost nothing to read. Next came the final test, full combat speed. The PT boat surged to its maximum, a blistering 40+ knots. Radar screens stayed nearly empty. The technicians stared, baffled. This wasn't possible. No vessel should be able to move that fast and remain off the scope. Something had to be wrong with the equipment. They recalibrated. They reset. They restarted. The result remained the same. The silent propeller wasn't just successful. It was revolutionary. Word reached the top of the chain quickly. Reports made their way to fleet commands. Admirals read with growing astonishment. Requests for production skyrocketed. The Navy began realizing that an entirely new class of stealth warfare was possible in the Pacific. But not everyone was convinced. Skeptics emerged, engineers who questioned reliability, commanders who doubted long-term durability, intelligence officers who warned the Japanese would adapt. Some suggested the results were exaggerated. Others believed the silent propeller might fail in rough seas or high-pressure engagements. So the Navy staged a final demonstration. Not a test, a challenge. A group of experienced radar operators and acoustic specialists were ordered to detect the PT boat. They were given full access to equipment, allowed to reposition antennas, granted complete authority to track by any means necessary sound, signal, or visual. The only rule: stop the boat from finishing its route undetected. They failed. Every single time. The engineer, watching from the pier as the PT boat completed its final run, finally allowed himself to relax. He had done more than build a propeller. He had created a tactical shift, a way for fragile wooden boats to evade some of the most advanced detection systems of the era. American officers celebrated cautiously. They knew the Japanese radar network wasn't perfect, but it was improving, and the silent propeller gave them a temporary but enormous advantage. Fleet commanders analyzed possible uses. Night raids, harbor infiltrations, surprise torpedo strikes, covert rescues. Even submarine commanders began asking if similar principles could be adapted underwater. For the first time in months, American forces felt ahead, not reacting but innovating. Through it all, the engineer who invented the silent propeller remained humble. He didn't seek credit. He didn't demand recognition. He only wanted one thing: to give those boys on the boats a chance to come home. And the silent propeller did exactly that. But its greatest test was still waiting, a real combat encounter where Japanese radar, patrol boats, and anti-ship defenses converged. A night when everything would hinge on whether the propeller worked under fire. Night after night, the silent propeller PT boats continued slipping deeper into Japanese coastal zones, each mission pushing the boundaries of what seemed possible. The crews no longer doubted the strange, counterintuitive method invented by a quiet engineer the Navy barely knew. They trusted it like a superstition, like a talisman. They watched the water behind them, saw the almost still surface, heard the strangely calm engine hum, and knew they were operating inside a loophole in Japanese detection, one created by a propeller no one believed would work. The Japanese radar operators, meanwhile, kept reporting the same impossible stories. Boats that appeared for an instant and vanished before they could be tracked. Boats that slipped behind patrols without triggering range gates. Boats that outran destroyers without leaving a wake. Boats that glided through the water like they were made of smoke. Commanders assumed equipment failure. Maintenance crews worked double shifts trying to recalibrate the sets. Technicians replaced components, rewired antenna feeders, and even blamed humidity for causing ghost returns. Every explanation was attempted except the truth that American PT boats were operating below their detection floor. During one operation, a Japanese destroyer squadron attempted a coordinated ambush. They arranged themselves in a wide arc, radar dishes rotating in synchronized sweeps, hydrophones deployed over the side. They waited through the entire night, expecting the Americans to repeat their predicted attack patterns, but nothing appeared. No signals, no wakes, no engine noise, no radar blips. At dawn, a Japanese lieutenant peered through binoculars and saw something that made no sense at all. Distant explosions along a transport anchorage. Explosions caused by torpedoes fired hours earlier by PT boats that had slipped through the destroyer cordon undetected. How did they pass? A commander demanded. The radar team had no answer. The hydrophone crew had no answer. The lookout stations had no answer. The lieutenant finally admitted quietly, "Sir, it was as if the boats had no engines." The phrase spread among Japanese sailors like a rumor of ghosts. The next test of the silent propeller came unexpectedly. A PT boat received a distress signal from a crippled American submarine trapped just off a heavily protected Japanese-controlled coastline. Radar stations covered the entire bay. Shore guns were positioned along ridges. Patrol craft crisscrossed the shallows. A rescue attempt was considered suicidal. But the skipper of PT-193 volunteered anyway. He knew the risks. He knew the enemy had layered defenses, but he also knew something the Japanese didn't, that the silent propeller trick, when used correctly, didn't simply reduce noise. It reshaped the entire acoustic footprint of the boat. He reduced power to the exact RPM range the engineer had taught them. The surface of the ocean stilled behind the hull. The engine pitched into its strange, subdued resonance, and the boat began gliding toward the coastline, invisible beneath radar thresholds. Inside Japanese radar stations, Operators scanned anxiously for any sign of an American approach. All they saw were faint, meaningless pulses, interference, noise, clutter, readings too small to register as real. They filtered them out instinctively. Those meaningless pulses, of course, were PT-193. The PT boat reached the bay without a single alarm sounding. Crewmen whispered to each other, marveling at how close they were to shore without hearing gunfire. When they finally spotted the crippled submarine partially surfaced under the shadow of a cliff, they momentarily forgot the danger. They were too stunned that the plan had worked. With torpedo nets blocking deeper channels, PT-193 maneuvered between them, using the narrow slalom paths normally reserved for fishing boats. The silent propeller allowed them to navigate without leaving a wake to give away their position. When they finally reached the submarine, the crew hurriedly transferred the injured men on board the PT boat. As they turned to leave, a Japanese patrol craft drifted into view just beyond the point. The PT crew froze. The Japanese vessel passed within 150 yards. For 20 seconds, everyone held their breath. The Japanese crew scanned the horizon but saw nothing. Their radar screen remained blank. They turned away casually, unaware that a fully loaded American rescue boat was floating silently in the shadows behind them. Only after the patrol disappeared behind a rocky outcrop did the PT boat accelerate, slowly at first, until they were far enough away to increase throttle safely. When they finally cleared the bay and entered open ocean, the entire PT crew erupted into relieved laughter, clapping each other on the shoulders. The silent propeller had not only enabled an impossible rescue, it had proved that the tactic could deceive Japanese radar even at close range, even under direct observation. When the rescued submarine crew was handed off later to a larger naval vessel, the captain read the rescue report twice. Then he said quietly, "We cannot allow this technology to remain a secret. Every PT boat must learn this." But the man who created the trick, the quiet engineer, wasn't thinking about fame. He was thinking about refinement. He studied every patrol report, every radar return, every sound signature. He scribbled equations late into the night, adjusting the relationships between cavitation thresholds, blade pitch angles, and RPM zones. He visited PT crews personally to explain tiny calibration details, adjustments so small they seemed irrelevant until tested in real combat. And the crews listened, because they trusted him more than their own manuals. The Japanese, meanwhile, were becoming increasingly haunted. Their coastal patrols reported ghost wakes, splashes and disturbances that appeared briefly at night but produced no radar confirmations. Some claimed to have seen shadows on the water. Others believed American submarines were surfacing inside bays that were supposedly impossible to infiltrate. But the truth was simpler. Their radar was being outmaneuvered by engineering. Eventually, a frustrated Japanese commander demanded proof that the Americans could not be inside the patrol zone. He ordered multiple radar sweeps and deployments of depth charges along the perimeter. The sea erupted with noise and spray, violent plumes rising where nothing was present. Inside one Japanese bunker, a radar operator stared at his screen, muttering, "They were here. I know they were here." "How can you know?" his officer asked. The operator pointed shakily at a faint mark, so small it barely registered. "This signal keeps appearing," he whispered. "Not strong enough to be a boat, but too consistent to be noise." His officer shook his head. "Then it is an error. No vessel can move that slowly without detection." But a PT boat could, if its engineer had silenced its propeller. When the Americans launched a coordinated night attack weeks later, the Japanese finally felt the full weight of the new tactic. A dozen PT boats moved along the coast simultaneously. each one gliding beneath radar beams like a shadow drifting over the surface. Japanese outposts saw nothing, no wakes, no silhouettes, no hornet-like engine roar. They were blind. When the torpedoes struck, the ocean lit up in jagged columns of fire. Ships buckled, anchor cables snapped, lookouts screamed warnings too late. The bay became a chaos of detonations and frantic evasive maneuvers. Only then did Japanese radar finally register the boats, when the PT skippers shoved their throttles to maximum to escape. The radar screens lit up in a panic of signals. Too late, one operator whispered. One after another, the silent boats vanished back into darkness. In later interrogations of captured Japanese officers, intelligence officers noticed a recurring theme. The psychological collapse did not come from the explosions. It came from not knowing where the attacks originated or how many attackers there were. One captured officer finally said it plainly. "We lost because we could no longer trust the water." When the quiet engineer learned of the statement, he didn't celebrate. He simply returned to his notes, adjusting the angles again, improving the formula. Because to him, the victory wasn't about glory. It was about solving a problem others couldn't even see. By the end of the campaign, Japanese commanders believed the Americans had created a new class of stealth vessel, some exotic machine unknown to intelligence. They called them the vanishing boats. Others gave them a more poetic nickname: night water spirits. But the American sailors knew the truth. They weren't spirits. They weren't supernatural. They weren't mythical. They were PT boats, transformed, empowered, and made invisible by a silent propeller that only one quiet engineer understood fully. An engineer whose idea rewrote naval warfare. An engineer who realized that victory didn't always belong to the loudest engine or the strongest ship. Sometimes victory belonged to silence.